for coming on the second best day of the year. I mean, after the spring, holy shit, pardon my French. They're going to cut that out. Thanks to KETV, who is here. They're filming this, that's great. They'll program it later. That didn't go out live, so no fear. They can say all kinds of stuff on National Public Radio now. Do you ever listen to that stuff? Yeah, anyway. That stuff. A couple of events I'm going to tell you about, and also here, the bathrooms. There is one in the kids' room around the corner. Otherwise, all the way back out, if you've never been here, they're in the basement. Take the elevator, come back up. This is an excellent time to turn off your cell phone, or at least put it on silence, so that we won't learn your ringtone. Next week, we have a bunch of things coming up. On Wednesday, September 18th, we're having a What to Know Before You Go event. Information on medical aid in dying, palliative care and advanced directives, and end-of-life paperwork. That'll be upstairs Wednesday at 7 o'clock. The day after that, on Thursday, September 19th, we're having an event about community restorative justice. If you don't know what that is, or you're interested in knowing what it is, this will be a very informing discussion of who gets into that program, why did they get into that instead of going right to jail or whatever. That's at 6 p.m. because they asked that we do it a little sooner. So Thursday, 6 p.m. And a week from then, there'll be a lieutenant governor's candidate forum here. There are 3 people running, I found out. David Zuckerman, John Rogers, and Ian Diamondstone. He must be the son of the Mr. Diamondstone who ran every year for everything. Yeah, I see a few head nods here. Anyway, there'll be a candidate forum here. That is Thursday, September 26th.
That's a lot.
Why you are here is to hear from Rachel Hadas and Murray Dewart, who we know as Mac. Some of you probably know him as Mac. And if you're not familiar with his sculpture, 2 options. Go to Catamount the next time you can. The Boston Sculpture Show is there. Or go outside of this building and go on this side lawn, and you'll see one of his beautiful pieces, which he gave to us 2014, I think. A beautiful piece. There's also one in the cemetery. I don't know if Mount Pleasant is open, but there are pieces of his work here, and you can experience them that way. Let me introduce Rachel. Poet, essayist, and translator. Rachel Hadas is the author of many books of poetry, including most recently Ghost Guest and Pandemic Almanac, both from Ragged Sky Press. A selection of her essays and criticism, piece by piece, was published by Paul Dry Books in 2021. Her newest collection of poems, 44 Pastorals, is forthcoming from Measure Press later this year. And a
Prosimetrum.
Thank you. Which you all knew is an alternating poetry and prose. You knew that. Entitled From Which We Start Awake, is due out in 2025. Her poem Voyage is included in the 2024 edition of the Best American Poetry Anthology. We have every single one of Rachel's books, and I'm not exaggerating, we have every single one. We have an NEK Authors collection. Every one of her books is in that collection. We have both circulating copies and we have special copies which you can come here and read. She is one of some 40 translators of the,
Tales of Dionysus. Just call it Tales of Dionysus.
There's that. An epic from late antiquity published by the University Press of Michigan in 2022 as Tales of Dionysus. She has also translated 3 plays by Euripides. As an editor and critic, she is particularly interested in medical humanities and translations from the classics in addition to poetry. She currently serves as Oxford English verse editor for Classical Outlook. She has taught English at Rutgers University, Newark. She taught from 81 to 2023 and was named Board of Governors Professor in 2001. She has also taught courses in literature and writing at Columbia and Princeton Universities, the 92nd Street Y, the Sewanee Writers Conference, and Westchester Poetry Conference, and the Hudson Valley Writers Center. Her honors include a Guggenheim Fellowship in Poetry an Ingram Merrill Foundation grant in poetry, an award for literature from the Academy Institute of Arts and Letters. She is the recipient of the O.B. Hardison Poetry Prize from the Folger Shakespeare Library and has been a fellow at the Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at New York Public Library. A member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, she has also been a resident of the MacDowell Colony, Yaddo, and the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. She lives in New York City and in Danville, Vermont, with her husband, visual artist and filmmaker Shalom Gorewitz, who is here. She has been collaborating on poetry and video. And just as a note, Rachel now has read in the Athenaeum more than anyone else who's ever read here. And she surpasses only Galway Cannell, who many of you know and saw here lots and lots of times. And Rachel is now the senior reader here at the Athenaeum.
Gosh, a lot of information.
Murray Dewart is an internationally recognized sculptor who has built large public and private sculptures in China, Israel, Peru, and across the United States in his 50-year career. In Sculpture magazine, he was called one of Boston's premier sculptors, and he has worked in more than 45 permanent collections, among them the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the De Cordova Museum and Sculpture Park, the Boston Athenaeum, the Shenzhuizian collections in China, Harvard University, the Rose Art Museum, the San Marco Museum in Peru, and the Haifa Museum of Art in Israel. He has been commissioned by 2 Chinese cities, Beijing and Fuzhou, to build large bronze and granite sculptures for their international sculpture parks, including one gate piece weighing 30 tons. A 30-foot sculpture was commissioned by the city of Boston and First Night in 1990 for a temporary installation on the Boston Common. His bronze Sun Gate was purchased in 2006 by Harvard University, and a 9-ton granite gate was commissioned for a park in Brookline to mark the town's 300th anniversary. His park project for the city of Cambridge, Mass. Has been described by critic Marty Carlock in Landscape Architecture magazine as a landscape gem hosting 3 world-class sculptures. He was a visiting artist at the Mishkanot in Jerusalem, and his park sculpture near Tel Aviv was dedicated in September 2013. He has won awards, lectured widely, and been featured on radio and television. He's been a frequent guest speaker at Harvard University, a visiting artist at MIT. He has served on the Fine Arts faculty of San Elm College, teaching sculpture and ritual. He is the editor of a Random House anthology, Poems About Sculpture, and that's here for you to take out, not today.
I took it out.
The rest of you are next. And the author of Hammer and Tongs, Journal of an Artist and Sculptor, a co-founder of Boston Sculptors Gallery. He is a graduate of Harvard College and Massachusetts College of Art. Please welcome Mac Dewart, Rachel Hadas.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm glad you all came. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I've known Rachel for 50 years or more, and we were on a board together at Harvard University, and she was a class ahead of me and a year younger. So obviously a protege of some kind, I was telling stories to my stuffed animals, and she was learning Greek. So tell us about your years as a prodigy, your early years.
I was not a prodigy. Thank you for that great introduction, Bob. And it's great to be here with Mac. And thank you for making this happen. Really, Mac made it happen, and Bob. And what a long, overwhelming introduction. And we're both so old now. We've done so much. We could just, sit back and rest on our crown. I feel as if I'm learning more all the time about how to be a human being, and when I think back to when I was young, it's kind of cringeworthy. I'm sure it's a human feeling, but I've always used poetry to understand what I'm feeling and to express what I'm feeling, maybe to express it and then to understand it. So I was not a prodigy, but I was lucky, I think, to major in classics. My older sister majored in English, and I thought, I don't need to do that. I can read Keats and E.E. Cummings and Dickens and whoever I wanted to read. I don't need to study to do that. And having studied classics has been more and more of a pleasure and a gift that keeps giving, sort of like Vermont. I mean, I landed here luckily because my parents had a place in Pumpkin Hill. Many people in this room have landed in Vermont one way or another, one generation ago or another, and Mac landed here in his own way and was born here, which I cannot claim. So I think I will just say, and toss the ball back to Mac, that I think poetry is a place where the inside and the outside meet. That attracted me to poetry early on. You had your private realm of dreams and emotions and experiences, and the public realm is obviously language. And then the older I got and the more well-traveled I became and politically aware, there's a big public realm out there of all kinds of things going on, many of them alarming, but poetry was a way to somehow join those two. So poetry can be both private and universal. I call it a shared privacy in my little afterword to the pandemic almanac. We're all sitting at home on Zoom. That feels very private and isolated, and yet it's shared. And I was thinking that Mac's signature doorway sculptures, a doorway is private and it's shared. We can all walk through a door, but it might mean something different to each of us, and we're going someplace different, which is sort of a Robert Frosty thought. So, okay, Mac.
So Larry Bacow, president of Harvard, says that it is only through the arts that we understand what it means to be human. You know, and I think of some of those lines of yours. Some of Rachel's lines are cut into the granite outside on used to be the front steps, and I had them cut. It's right outside that door. And, you know, there's that line, mankind's condition, our punishment, a blessing and our punishment.
A blessing and a punishment.
Nothing is given, all is lent. You know, another line, you know, I swam a shark-infested sea. I love that line.
It's not literally true.
Rings a bell for me, the sharp, you know, Emily Dickinson, what I love about Rachel has endured. Rachel is a long, enduring artist. And, you know, some people think, you know, artists were butterflies, you know, or just like butterflies. But for me, I always see myself as a draft horse pulling a plow across a far American landscape. You know, that's the long endurance. You know, Emily Dickinson said she saw herself as David against the Goliath of the world. You know, the world is just trying to talk us out of being artists.
Well, we start by being artists, and many, many people stop or they run out of steam. So Mac and I have sort of kept at it in our separate ways. Yeah.
I guess I have to forgive my friends who stop. I find it hard to give them a blessing when they stop. You know, on the one hand, you know, artists are on the spectrum. You know, on the one hand, we self-identify as holy idiots. And then on the other end, you know, David Smith, the sculptor on Bolton's Landing, you know, said, artists and artists alone constitute the only true aristocracy. Well, we like the sound of that. You know, that's, you went to Greece after college. I came to Vermont and lived on a hill farm in the Champlain Valley for 5 years. No running water, no telephone, and I taught myself. Was that an eccentric thing to do? I suppose in other times that would seem eccentric, but in 1970, when, you know, the world was in turmoil, that made sense to me. And you know, Wallace Stegner, once upon a time in Greensboro, said that we all have a heroic period in our lives. You know, you think back to when it was. And for me, those years on that hill farm, 100-acre hill farm, it was like out of Robert Frost. What was your heroic period?
I don't think I think in those heroic terms as much as you do. I was thinking of Robert Frost because someone said, oh, you live in this little tiny town, Ripton, you know, what do you do after dark? Everything stops. And Robert Frost said, I go on all night. And I feel as if in the world of books and the world of poetry, there's a huge companionship. So in a way, being in a quiet place where there's time to read and write is an ideal environment. So I think of different heroic periods. I mean, I think I have a son now who's 40, but I think motherhood is heroic. And there is a squeeze of time and energy. It's hard to remember now, but when I see people with young children, I think, how do they do it? It's not easy. My late husband was very ill for a long time. Caregiving is heroic in its own way. My father died when I was 17, which kind of jump-started me into poetry in some ways, and I dealt with the grief. I didn't necessarily deal with it well, but I dealt with it. So these are all things I survived. And then teaching for 40 years at Rutgers, the most wonderfully diverse group of students before diversity, equity, and inclusion became a watchword. It simply was the case that these students came from all over the world. I could have students speaking 40 languages in one not very big class. And no one taught me how to teach. You don't really learn how to teach, you just do it. So that was its own kind of heroism. And only looking back, I think, gee, I went on doing all that. And I cooked dinner, or I did this, I fed the cat. And I've been extraordinarily lucky in the last 10 years to have Shalom nurturing me and uplifting me. So that doesn't feel heroic, that just feels lucky. And I think Mac has been lucky in that way too. So I would prefer to call it luck, but hero's an okay word. I think your sculptures are heroic, and when you talk about being a draft horse, I mean, stone is a heavy medium. Poetry is very light. It takes up no room. At the same time, one of my favorite words for poetry is lapidary, which means engraved. It stays there in your head. I read huge numbers of poems professionally, and most of them just float away. I've forgotten them before I turn the page, so I appreciate staying power.
So a lot of my friends ask the question, you know, as long-suffering artists, is like, when is my destiny realized? You know, I remember Frank Bedard and Robert Lowell and Marla May and, you know, talked about destiny. And my wife said, my destiny was realized when I gave birth to 2 sons. You know, and I thought, well, it's like women get the chance to bring life into the world. Artists, I mean, we get to bring a kind of life into the world that endures. You know, like sculptors, we wear out our bodies, you know, and our hands and our backs and our eyes and our lungs, trying to make the form, you know, we say, come alive. We want the form to come alive and have a spark, even when we are long gone. But you mentioned giving birth, so that shows up in your poetry.
It shows up in a book I wrote when my son was young, and I remember giving a reading in New Jersey when he was very young, and somebody in the audience came up to me and said, when our kids were little, my wife was writing those poems too. And I thought, oh, those poems, that sort of generic motherhood poems. You find out over the years what being a mother means because it never really stops. And one of my most popular poems was called The Red Hat. I'd have to recite it and I'll get it wrong, but I wrote it when my son was about 9 and beginning to walk to school alone in New York. And I got a lot of letters from people who had read it in the New Yorker, and they instinctively used the rhetorical trope metonymy. They'd say, my red hat is 17, how old is yours? Or how old was your red hat? So that tug in your heart when you have a child doesn't really stop. That's its own form of heroism. In terms of the physicality of giving birth, other people have written about that maybe more vividly than me, but that's true too. But I'd say it's the long haul. It's bringing up a child and watching that process of separation. Mac mentioned Frank Bedard, Robert Lowell. When I was at Harvard, I was scared to apply for Robert Lowell's course in English because I wasn't crazy about his poetry, and he seemed to me to have a slightly baleful effect on his students. If he had a nervous breakdown, they would have a nervous breakdown. And I took a very gentle course instead with Robert Fitzgerald, maybe better known as a translator of Homer. And Fitzgerald would write in the margins of a poem, and all his assignments were metrical, very formal, very focused. He'd write NTB, not too bad, or NG, not good. And that's all he would write. And he is not remembered as a poet now, although he was a wonderful poet, but he is definitely remembered as a translator. And I've sort of come around to appreciating the classics more and more. You teach for 40 years, and you realize that there's a reason the Iliad is a classic or the Aeneid is a classic. I'm in a Zoom discussion group right now that meets weekly. We read Ovid's Metamorphoses, some of us in Latin, and now we're reading Virgil. It doesn't get old, it just changes. So teaching has been another great, lucky pleasure.
Indoor work, no heavy lifting.
Right, right.
You know, most artists, you know, have to have a day job, you know, and teaching is a reasonable day job. So John Keats said that work of any consequence grows out of a parable, an allegory that an artist is leading, and the work is a comment on the parable. So, you know, people ask me, you know, well, what's your parable, Mac? You know, and is it glib when I say, you know, I'm on the road to Jerusalem in a way I cannot explain? So, Rachel, what's your parable?
I tried to prepare an answer to this. But I would just say, if there's a through line in my work, and I'm not sure there is, it's a series of conversations. It's like going into a room and shutting the door. And I did quite a lot of work with Gay Men's Health Crisis, with people with AIDS in New York in the 80s. I did caregiving, was running support groups. There's motherhood. There is teaching, and editing. Now that I'm older, I seem to be wearing an editor's hat. All of those is a series of conversations around a topic. I have private students too, now that I've retired. So it's not so much a parable as a metaphor, that some kind of connection. Paul Muldoon, a wonderful poet who's just about to retire from Princeton, said, making art is about human connections, and that's why it feels good. I mean, I love the Keats quote, but he was 24 when he wrote it, and it could mean almost anything. But yeah, that parable turns up. Mac has a very enjoyable memoir, which I also took out of the Athenaeum, but anybody can take it out now. And he's very inspired by literature, which is great. I don't know how many sculptors are so literary. He knows much more about poetry than I do about sculpture. And it's true that when you talk about the arts, something can click. You can think, that painter has something that's worth saying to me, and so forth. So.
I'm giving the books away, so if you want one, take one. They're all free. Donation to the Athenaeum.
I have a bunch of books on the table too. Yeah, help yourself. It's a nice thing.
So Kokoschka said, if you last as an artist, you'll live to see your reputation die 3 times. And I think I'm on my third. Which is, it's better than having an early career that, you know, great flash in the pan, and then you're in your midlife and people say, well, what happened? What happened to you?
Yeah, I mean, people in the arts get a lot of attention when they're very young, and then if they last long enough, they might get attention when they're 75 or 80, and in between can seem like a dry period, but as Mac wisely says, you just stick it out. And you do not know what will happen to your reputation, and there's no point worrying about it. That line Mac quoted, "Nothing is given, all is lent." Lent as in lending a library book. That is up in the library at Rutgers, Newark. So if you think of everything as temporary and contingent, the idea being pass it on. I love to give books away or refer people to poems. It's not mine, it's to pass on. And I think that helps to think about reputation. It can be hard when you see a younger writer and you think, I don't like that, but that's okay. And you do get a sense of perspective as you get older. You sort of see the ups and downs of fashion. I am very impressed by how healthy the art of poetry is. Whether it's riding the subway in New York and there's a poem up there and all the poetry websites, poetry is very durable. I mean, the news in the paper is not good, but the news from poetry is actually not bad.
So we open the New Yorker, you read the first line or two lines.
Yeah, and then you say,
but it's hard,
away.
because it's a single poem. You don't know, it's not like a book of poems where you try this, try that, try this. Yeah.
Robert Frost said, I'm learning from Mac to quote other artists a lot. So Robert Frost said, "I would like to lodge a few poems where they're hard to get rid of," which sounds like a splinter under your nail or a blackberry seed between your teeth, but certainly memorizing poems is a great resource. That's a great pleasure.
So I always think of the poetry world as being purer than the art world. The art world at the very top is filled, it's money laundering. Yeah. It's these like $100 million for a silk screen, and and it goes and sits in a safe in Switzerland, and the artist down at the bottom, struggling. There's that story of the painter on his deathbed. His two dealers come and sit on either side of him. He looks up and he says, I'm feeling positively Christ-like. And they say, Maestro, why is that? He says, because I'm dying here between two thieves.
Yeah, poetry, W.H. Auden famously said, poetry makes nothing happen. There's some debate about that. I don't know if visual art makes things happen, but there's no question that the fact that art can be monetized and is monetized is very different from poetry. And also, art takes up space. I feel mixed about that when Mac describes lifting things, and my husband's family was very much in the art world, and people die, and there's a lot of art that's left. Poetry doesn't strike me as weighty in that way. It's weighty in another way. Homer talks about winged words. On the other hand, once a word has winged its way out, it's out there, and it's very hard to get it back. We see that in the world of social media. Mac and I grew up in the world of mimeographs and maybe Xeroxes, but certainly no social media. And we're told that AI is going to be able to write poems that are really excellent. Who knows? A very wonderful poet I know, A.E. Stallings, we have her books as well, has said she's not afraid that AI will write poems that could have been written by people, but that people will start writing poems that could have been written by AI. It's really a time to wonder about what being human might mean.
But in poetry and in sculpture, we get to do the big questions. You're not writing advertising copy or limericks. I'm not making tchotchkes. We get to go to the big pictures of, the big questions of human life, and that's why I was drawn to it. I was born into a family of clergy. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather was a Methodist minister, and he said to his two sons, if you want to drink and dance, get out of the Methodist church. So two of his sons became Episcopal, and there's that story, you get 4 Episcopalians And there's always a fifth, Jack Daniels or Jameson. Anyway, my parents came to St. Johnsbury after the war in '45 when a great wave of people came. And he had the church in St. Andrews, he had St. Peter's in Lyndonville, and a barn in East Concord. 3 services in one day. It kind of wore him out.
Mac has a passage in his memoir about somebody is dying, and first you have the doctor, and then you have the priest, and then maybe you have the sculptor to make a death mask. Although he was glad he didn't make the death mask, right?
I did not make the death. It was a doctor in St. Johnsbury had a roll-top desk. My father bought it. He used it for his entire career, and then I used it. But the sequence, the patient doesn't need a doctor. This patient needs a priest, and when the priest is done, the sculptor comes. The Pope has somebody, when the Pope goes into his last decline, there's a sculptor gets ready with plaster, phone call, gets ready to make the death mask.
There's something about sculpture which is, it makes you forget how fleeting human life is, because sculpture stays there, and yet one of the poems in Mac's anthology is Ozymandias by Shelley, where, this maybe you should read them, Ozymandias. I have it, it's here, isn't it? And that there's a broken statue standing in the sand, and all that's left is a leg and an inscription. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings.
Look on me.
Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. Yeah. So Emily Dickinson, who is, the opposite of heavy and weighty, has a couple of lines. The poets light but lamps themselves go out. Go out meaning like a candle flame going out. But they've lit the lamp and it gets passed on. One of my books is called Pass It On. And Sharon Olds, whom some of you might have heard read many times here or in Browning at the Highland Center for the Arts, talks about Muriel Rukeyser, a mid-20th century poet, heroically going to some prison and reading her poems in the prison yard. And Sharon said, pass it on. This woman is standing reading her poems to prisoners. And pass it on is not a bad thing for the artist to say. Keats said that his epitaph should be, here lies one whose name was writ in water, because Keats was young, ill, poor, dying, despairing, and thought, this has all been for nothing. I've been ambitious, but it's all over. I'm 25, I'm dying. But look at Keats now. He's secure in the canon, whatever that means. He means a great deal to a great many people. So the aspiration of art is a beautiful thing. I'd like to read a poem, but I think Mac might have something he wants to read. I don't know.
I'm going to read your Love and Dread poem. And Love and Dread. A desiccated daffodil, a pigeon cooing on the sill. The old cat lives on love and water. Your mother's balanced by your daughter. One faces death, one will give birth. The fulcrum of our life on earth. I love that line. The fulcrum is our life on earth. Beginning, ending in a bed. We have to marry, love and dread. Dark clouds are roiling in the sky. The daily drumbeat of the lie, steady, no crescendoing, this premature, deceptive spring. Forsythia's in bloom already. The challenge, balance, keep it steady. Now, sniffing daffodil's aroma, now Googling a rare sarcoma. The ghost cats, weightless on my lap, my mother's ghost floats through my nap. As dearest heart, we lie in bed. Oh, we must marry, love and dread, must shield our senses from the glare and clamor of chaos everywhere. Life bestows gifts past expectation. It's time to plan a celebration. Dance at the wedding, drink and sing, certain that summer follows spring, that new life blossoms from the past. The baby is the youngest guest. But just now, how long can we depend on a recurrence without end? Everything changes, even change. The tapestry of seasons strangely stirs in an uneasy wind that teases dreamlike through the mind. I reach for you across the bed. Oh, how to marry love and dread. It's a good one.
Thank you. And I think that's what poetry is about. I mean, poetry has always been about love, and it's always been about the fear of loss. And we're told to accept change in a calm Buddhist way, but I think it goes against our nature not to fear and not to react to change.
We want to hold on to being alive, to being human beings. You know, what are these pictures all about? You know, if your house is burning, what do you run in and grab? You grab the pictures of your children and your parents.
Yeah, you want to hold on to something. I'm going to read a poem from last summer. I've started writing more about politics and climate change just around the time I wrote Love and Dread, early in 2017, not long after the presidential inauguration. And there was a baby, and there was an illness, and there was a dying cat, although I tweaked the truth a little bit. Poets do that.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
But
we lie in order to tell the truth.
Right, that's right. So I refer to local flooding here last summer. Of course, it happened this summer as well. And I also refer briefly to Greece and Hawaii that suffered catastrophic fires last summer. And I also am quoting Lucretius, a wonderful Roman poet who, I'm sort of giving glosses on the poem ahead of time. Hope that's okay. Lucretius has a very interesting passage which is about what we might now call schadenfreude. He says, it's really nice to stand on a calm cliff and look down at a storm-tossed sea. And he immediately realizes that doesn't sound very nice. And he says, don't think that I enjoy watching people drowning. It's just that I realize how tranquil my life is. That doesn't help much either. But, so my poems are going to be about local stuff. There might be the voice of a poet in there, some ancient poet that I bring in, a little geography, maybe a little more of the public realm. This is called Flood and Fire and Bureau Drawer. The water Andric, once a slender thread flowing clear and brown, is now a flood, white water carrying down trees along. The sheep dip, once a swimming hole, is gone. Over in Montpelier, canoes paddle past the Capitol, confused cows in a bedroom, trout in a bureau drawer. The rains let up, and then it rained some more. The rushing water had no place to go, creatures and crops alike lost in its flow. Carrying her dog to safety, she lost her footing, slipped, was swept away. Relentless power of water on the move, as strong as gravity, stronger than love. More and more the elements conspire, confronting us with water or with fire. From Rhodes to Maui, a thin strip of sand to huddle on, with death on either hand. And migrants setting sail to hoped-for lives, pack into boats, are swallowed by the waves. What's the best vantage point? From where can we get a perspective on humanity? Find a safe place, Lucretius writes, and you see struggling people, It's a splendid view. Pythagoras, too, a passenger on cloud, saw mankind as baffled and afraid. Some of us help our neighbors in the flood after the fire, as we always did. Love and dread, the known and the unknown. We try to live as we have always done. How long can we go on living this way? Is it too late, as fire and water say? This house sits on a hill. We've had good luck. Still, windows, doors, and bureau drawers are stuck. Having tugged a faded t-shirt out, I breathe in layers of memories, summer, sweat, and sunshine, fragrance fainter than the mold or mildew. These shirts, like me, have grown old. Of winters in this empty house, whose cold rises like a specter from each fold. So when you're writing a poem, you feel a little better, and then the news prevails again. Auden says that poets who are not actively writing feel like fakes, that you should be working on something all the time, but I've gotten more relaxed about that. I can think, I have an idea in my head and it will take time. So even though getting old, I have less time, in a strange way I feel I have more time, partly being retired. And how do you feel about that, Mac, about the urgency to work?
Well, you've broached the idea that we are in a dystopian time, floods and fires. And, the question I would ask, what would we put into the final Athenaeum? What 5 things, that, we say art reminds us, is the only thing that tells us what it means to be human. What would you put into that last Athenaeum? Would it be something from Plato, something from Mozart, something from Michelangelo, maybe one of the Gospels? What else? Somebody will email me the last 5th thing to go into that last Athenaeum.
It's an alarming question. Mac thinks on a very large, heroic scale, and I don't. I'd say, maybe we could get suggestions from the audience, but teaching is a way of suggesting certain things. We can't include it all, but we can make you aware of this and this and this.
In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. The conversation.
And Eliot says, Eliot may have been canceled, I hope not, but he says in an essay from just about 100 years ago called Tradition and the Individual Talent that the existing monuments have to move over a little to make room for what's new, or they get slightly rearranged, which is a very sculptural idea. The poet Alicia Stallings has written a wonderful book-length essay about the Elgin marbles, which are still a subject of contention between the British Museum and Greece. Who do they belong to? Who should have them? And it's a wonderful essay, very upsetting to read, because Lord Elgin hired people to take big sledgehammers and knock those things off. It's unbelievable. I recommend it. And speaking of monuments, the great Greek poet Sepphoris, who won the Nobel Prize around 1968, has a long poem called Mythical History, and one section begins, "I awoke with this marble head in my hands. It exhausts me and I don't know how to put it down." And the marble head could be the classical tradition, some kind of a fragment. So maybe, as Max says, poetry and sculpture have always kind of worked together. And Keats was very fascinated by the Elgin marbles and went and sat in the British Museum. But they're so fragmentary. They're so sad looking in a way. So it's an ongoing argument. The British had the nerve to say, well, we can take care of them better than the Greeks. And there's too much air pollution in Greece anyway, and the Greeks built a beautiful museum to put them in. It's a minor art thing maybe, but maybe not so minor in the world.
Well, the conversation itself is a cultural story. the conversation itself. Louise Glick won the Nobel Prize. With her prize money, she bought a house in Montpelier. She used to live a lot at Goddard and in Montpelier, had a restaurant that she owned, and took the prize money, bought a house in Montpelier, and promptly died.
Yeah.
But she said, why do I write? Because I want to live after I die.
Well, that's what we all would like in some way. Yep. James Merrill, I was fortunate to be a friend of. He was a great poet who died in 1995, and he left his house to the little town, the little borough of Stonington, Connecticut, near New London. And he simply left his house to the town, but some clever lawyers sort of parlayed it into an artist's residence, so that now young poets can go and spend a month in Merrill's house and often see his ghost and read his books and be nurtured. And I mean, Edna St. Vincent Millay's estate became something like that. And that's a wonderful, I think it's easier for me to think on that scale than some kind of cosmic Athenaeum. Merrill took joy in his house, wrote about it, and wanted other people to have that opportunity. What's happening to Louise's house? Do you know?
I don't know.
Yeah.
But our great privilege as artists is to be in conversation with the artists of the past. I mean, this guy, you can't add a word to what he was trying to tell us, that sense of the American landscape.
The Athenaeum was selling wonderful tote bags. Do they still have them, Bob? I'm always buying them up. And
I mean, some people say that great American artists have all been solitaries. Camus said that, D.H. Lawrence said that, and Eliot Lawrence and Camus. And Robert Pinsky disagrees with this. But the huge landscape of this continent, where solitary artists, set up shop, bring their tools. There's something about the vastness. I mean, I know in Russia and in China, the same thing goes on. I used to teach painting to some Russian students, and when we did landscapes, you could feel the hugeness as their imagination started to depict the landscape. There was something distinctly Russian, and it's true in China. So the American landscape is working on art the same way. So there's a sculptor out in the desert for 50 years, Michael Heiser, has been working on 1 square mile of the Nevada desert with bulldozers. He ruined his health, he ruined his marriage, he's hanging on by a thread. An American solitary.
But I think a lot of those solitary men had women in their lives and families at some time or other. I know Camus, Lawrence. So it's a little bit of an exaggerated myth, I think, possibly a heroic myth. They might have had a woman making dinner. Who knows? Lisa's nodding. He was nodding.
The history of art is the history of noisy artists. It's the history of artists who share tools, who share studios, maybe girlfriends and boyfriends, but the shared strategies. You'd have to say the history of art, that all of these painters were working side by side with people. They were not probably alone.
Right. Certainly the studios and the apprentices and the Renaissance, and you learn by sitting at someone's feet. I gave a beautiful Bierstadt tote bag to a friend a year or so ago, and she was carrying it in Brooklyn to the local cheese shop, and the cheesemonger said, "Oh, that's a Bierstadt." That made me feel great. A kind of a shared form of reference. And I took a drawing class at the Metropolitan Museum this spring. I was actually sitting there when the earthquake happened in April, and the Metropolitan vibrated, which took a lot. And I thought, there's a lot of heavy stuff here. We were near a statue of a pharaoh, and the floors, someone said, "Is that the subway?" I said, I don't think so.
Was it an earthquake?
Yeah, it was the earthquake in April. But the teacher was extremely young. He looked about 18 to me, and he loved Bierstadt. And that was wonderful to me. It's a shared frame of reference. And he said he'd written a paper on the poetry of William Cullen Bryant, who is a pretty much forgotten early 19th century American poet, that Bryant Park is named after him near the New York Public Library. And William Cullen Bryant wrote a poem called Ode to a Waterfowl, sort of like Wordsworth and Audubon rolled into one. But I don't know much about William Cullen Bryant, but this 18-year-old did. How wonderful. So the sense of a conversation. And speaking of conversations, we should probably open it up for questions.
Well, read something of mine, of your favorite piece.
Oh, in here? There's so many things I like. There's a wonderful poem by Mac's cousin, Julia Randall, that you quote.
I can recite it. Would you like it?
Oh, yes, please do. Yeah.
I think she took the Gnostic word for God is shadow of a turning. And the poem is called Tallis Cannon, who's, is a great church musician. And I used to teach this, because it's a poem about waking up with your lover. You want college students to wake up? They'll listen to this poem. Dawn wind, smelling of smoke, from the smoldering trash gully breathes me awake. I can imagine the lake rippling its dark, taut silk a moment, and the breeze like a cloud shadow moving to pick up the invisible particles of smoke. Dawn wind, pick up my prayer, coming awake from the dangerous, dark, blood side of the world, and soon with the sun in the still unseen, regular dawn forgotten, coming back from sleep, going away into love. Lord, that I am a moment of your turning. Lord, that I am a moment of your turning. That was Poetry magazine put that on the back cover when she died.
Oh, that's nice. You quote her somewhere as saying, we love beginnings. As artists, we love beginnings.
We are in love with beginnings.
Yeah.
In all things.
I mean, if you're, especially poems, which might be faster to write than a sculpture is to make, but you get to start over, you get to redo something, you get to put the old poem away and start the new poem. And I think most poets I know and respect are constantly struggling with what they will do next, which I really respect. I was thinking actually of the poem called The Bennett Springs Road by Julia Randall. I'll just read a few lines. It's very elemental, and it seems to be about mortality and the countryside. On the road to Bennett Springs, tired of the paltry ridges, I lay down, the last of my youth, where all the gods had grown, became the water falling over stone, became the forest father to red men, became the tribe of stars, both daughter and son, the mother of moss, the bird that sang I am. There's a huge range in those few lines of whether it's nature or Native Americans, gender, generations. Poetry can do so much in so few lines. Shalom and I were going to have a t-shirt printed that said, I'm old, give me the short version. I'm old, give me the short version. And in a way, that's what poetry does.
It's true, the short version. I asked Julia, you had that one line, I lay down the last of my youth. Yeah, I said, was there a sexual component to that? And she said, no.
Oh, well. So there's so much to say, but I think you get the sense, we're both lucky in what we do, fortunate, and also poetry can be so private. I feel, in a way, lucky anyone's ever wanted to read anything I've written. I remember years ago, I sent my mother a poem. I used to show her my work, and then I stopped, and she said, well, this is very nice, but no one would understand it if they didn't know you. And there is
Thanks,
that.
Mom.
But there is that quality. Poetry needs to be clear. It doesn't have to be simple-minded, but the older I get, the more I want it to be clear. Alicia Stalling says, you cannot be too clear, you cannot be too obvious. And I think that maybe around the time Mac and I were in college, a little later, a lot of American poetry was very hermetic, very difficult, and that made it hard for anyone to like it, to enjoy it, to relate to it. And then a lot of that difficult poetry just kind of went away.
So the poetry shifted to the rock music and to Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones. The poetry shifted to people who could make it comprehensible. I wanted to talk about Vermont and dreamers, the way Vermont attracts dreamers. And, you know, Peter Schumann up in Glover, you know, it's a place of, sometimes these dreams work out and sometimes they don't. You know, with Peter Schumann, it certainly worked out. He's just endlessly telling these amazing stories. He used to come down to Boston and in the first night processions. And I was with the washerwomen once, one of his washerwomen parades. In the town of Benson, where I lived, there was a man named Graham Carey of Vanderbilt, and he had this vision. He was going to start a community of poets and sculptors and potters. He invited sculptors from England, you know, and he built a church. It's still there, Christ, Son of Justice, Catholic agrarian movement, cut short by the war. But it didn't work out. And I think of Scott Nearing. Does anybody remember Scott Nearing? Oh, yeah. Heads nod. I used to use his book, sugaring book, when I had the sugaring operation in the Champlain Valley. And I guess he's father-in-law to Peter Schumann once upon a time. I may have that wrong. Is that true? But anyway, he got tired of Jamaica and left and went to Maine. Well, what's that about? You know? But it's a wonderful way that Vermont works on the imagination. I remember when you came, Jake, moved to St. Johnsbury and drawn for sense of wide opportunity or something. It was a wonderful, to see you do that was wonderful.
I think most Vermonters, many of us realize how lucky we are to be here. It's also a time when there's a lot of homelessness, and you know, Vermont is not a pastoral refuge. It's never that simple. My new book, 44 Pastorals, is actually taking poems I've written over the past 30 years, written up here, about here, and they tend to overlap. They're very much about nature and about memory, and I realize that you could say, well, that's not really engaging with the real world. It's very private. But pastoral has actually always been private. It's been talking about bigger things through smaller things. And you can see Mac has a heroic imagination, which is great, and I don't. So that's okay. I think it's true that artists often have a vision of some community, let's build a better world, and it indeed does not always work out. And that's part of, you know, it's interesting to see through history how artists have worked in societies or outside. I think it's almost time for some Q&A, don't you, Mac?
I always like to end with this line from Martin Luther King,
All right.
you know,
okay.
who said, you know, the salvation of the world is in the hands of the creatively maladjusted. Rachel, that's us. That's you and me. Creatively maladjusted. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we're happy to take questions, if any, or we can have a glass of wine. It's sometimes easier to talk when that's happening.
Anyway, okay.
Actually, yeah, I mean, I enjoyed the rhyme of aroma and sarcoma. They're both Greek words. And I remember when I read that poem a few years ago, someone started laughing because it was so unexpected. Sarcoma was a new word to me. Anything can go into a poem, anything at all. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
When you said something about a piece that you're going to be publishing about awake, is there, you were talking about, I thought at the very beginning you were speaking about books that are coming out, or...
Oh yeah, from which we start awake. Okay, a prosimetrum it's a new word to me. It means sort of metered prose. So it's a very old form where you have prose with a poem in it, or you're alternating chapters of poetry and prose. And one of the poems in it ends with the idea of we're dreaming and then we wake up, from which we start awake into our lives. So the theme of the book, the genre is prosimetrum, alternating poetry and prose. The theme is mythology, because I've taught a lot of courses in mythology. I've written a lot about mythology over the years. So it was a lot of fun early in 2023. I would take poems, some recent, some not, that I'd written about mythology, but then I wrote a little short essay to go with each one of them. So the essays were all new, even though the poems were not all new. And put together chronologically, the essays were like a kind of mini memoir. So this was going on in the classroom, this is what I was reading, this is what I was teaching. Meanwhile, I was working with people with AIDS, or meanwhile, I was doing this or that. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Patricia. I think it's coming out in the spring, stay tuned. Yeah. Yeah, Dave.
I'm interested in your decisions about scale, the size of your work, and how you come to a certain dimension, how you conceive it, and what you think that contributes to the message to somebody looking at it.
Well, the landscape always makes things look small. So I try to sometimes set up something as a model to try to establish scale. And sometimes you want a sculpture to sort of tuck up next to a building or a tree, somehow to give it less of a solitary presence in a landscape. But scale is, you have to be really fastidious in deciding about scale. So I just installed in Michigan, I sold a big sculpture to a museum in Michigan, and you know, I was agonizing. It was like 9 feet, but they tucked it close to the building, and it felt right.
We have a very nice piece in New York about the height of this microphone by Mack, and it's clearly something by Mack. His pieces share a style, but it's small enough to put on a shelf, although it's heavy. And so he seems to have a sense of scale. I mean, sculpture can be too big or almost too small. I think your sense of scale just works for me, yeah.
There's a Noguchi in front of the Metropolitan Museum. I think it was a little small, so to make it bigger, they put it on a big base. Mistake. The base kind of sucks the energy out of the sculpture. So even the Metropolitan Museum can make a mistake.
I think the net was also to keep it from skateboarders from hitting it. The piece in front of the Met, it was also a little bit about human interaction. Skateboarders and other people were trying to go up against it a bit as well. But I agree with your comment about that especially whether it's Noguchi or Brancusi, the idea of putting it on a pedestal is maybe not so desirable.
What does he say?
I'm thinking of our golden ball exercise. Things on pedestals. Yeah, the launch of this lovely little anthology was at the, one launch was at the Noguchi Museum in Long Island City in New York. It's a wonderful museum, and Robert Pinsky was there, and that was a great event, like 2016, I think. And it's an interesting idea to put together poems about sculpture. I mean, you know that the poem about the Statue of Liberty, Give Me Your Tired, Your Poor, it was a sonnet written in a competition. Who would write the best poem to be engraved there? So Emma Lazarus won that competition. And Ozymandias, Shelley and some friends were playing around with the idea of writing a sonnet about this big broken image that they found. And I think the other poem is in here as well, which is very good. So, yeah, Eva?
The poem that you wrote about the environment, I think it might be the second poem that you read. Is that, what year is that from?
The Flood and Fire one?
Yeah.
That's from last summer.
Oh, that's right. Is that a part of the book?
It's going to be in the book.
Okay.
And I take a few liberties. I mean, the person who was carrying a dog to safety and drowned was in New York, not Vermont. But it doesn't matter, does it? The trout, a friend of my son's who lives near Montpelier said, there were trout in the filing cabinets in Montpelier. And I said, were they alive or dead? But he didn't know the answer to that. So there is a kind of humor. These ancient poets like Lucretius, who lived around the time of Julius Caesar's assassination quite a while ago, and Virgil both wrote so well about floods. They could be describing what we read in the Caledonian. You know, the bridge went out and the tree went down and the culvert. So to read about floods, which they clearly experienced, was uncanny. So maybe, you know, climate disaster isn't new exactly.
So last anecdote, Vermont and poetry. Adlai Stevenson at the 1960 convention, he was speaking to a group of delegates, and his final message to them, this is why, was Adlai Stevenson too intellectual. He recited Robert Frost's Stopping by a Woods on a Snowy Evening, saying to the delegates that he, Adlai, had miles to go before he slept.
That wouldn't happen now, would it?
Thank you for coming.
Thanks so much for coming.
There is food and drink here. I hope you'll stay around for that. You can talk personally with both Rachel and Matt. It'll be out there. It'll give us just a couple of minutes to set up. Stay in here and talk, but come out there in a few minutes and share a glass of wine or something non-alcoholic and some food.